The real purpose of growing old, and what most people only understand too late. There is something I want to share with you today, something I have learned slowly over many decades of living. And I speak now not as someone who has all the answers, but as someone who has simply lived long enough to notice patterns that were invisible when I was younger. Growing old is not what most people think it is. From the outside, it looks like loss, like things slowly being taken away, strength, speed, status, relevance. But from the inside, it is something very different. It is not the closing of a story. It is the beginning of a different kind of understanding. And if I had to put it into words, I would say there are certain things the soul begins to ask for in the second half of life. Things that no longer depend on achievement or recognition, but instead depend on awareness, honesty, and presence. And so I want to begin with the first thing I have learned, the first shift that changes everything, and that is learning to be able to keep your own company. Now, when I was younger, I did not understand the value of silence. Silence felt empty. Silence felt like something had gone wrong. I needed noise, people, movement, tasks, responsibilities, anything that gave me the feeling that I was needed. And for a long time, life supports that illusion. You are surrounded by obligations, by work, by family needs, by constant demands on your attention. You measure your worth by how full your day is, how many people depend on you, how many problems you are solving. But then, slowly, life begins to change its rhythm. The phone does not ring as often. The urgency of being needed begins to fade. Roles shift, children grow, work responsibilities disappear, and suddenly there are long stretches of quiet that you did not plan for. And at first, that quiet can feel uncomfortable, even frightening, because it feels like something has been taken away from you. But over time, if you do not rush to fill it with distraction, something surprising begins to happen. You start to hear yourself again. And I do not mean thoughts in the usual sense. I mean something deeper than that. You begin to notice the parts of yourself that were always there but never had space to speak. You begin to remember things you had forgotten not because they were gone, but because life was too loud to notice them. Old interests return, old emotions surface, old questions that were never answered begin to quietly reappear. And what you slowly realize is that being alone is not the same as being abandoned. In fact, it becomes one of the most important skills of later life, the ability to sit with yourself without immediately trying to escape it. Because a person who cannot be with themselves will always depend too heavily on the outside world for stability. But a person who learns to be with themselves develops a kind of inner grounding that no external change can easily disturb. And strangely enough, that is when loneliness begins to dissolve, not because people are constantly around you, but because you are no longer running away from your own presence. And that naturally leads me to the second thing I have learned, and this one is not easy for many people, because it requires honesty rather than comfort. The second thing is the courage to face what you carry inside yourself, the parts of your story that you would rather avoid. Because once life becomes quieter, once distractions are no longer constant, something else begins to happen. Memories begin to surface, not only the pleasant ones, but also the ones you have spent years trying not to think about. Regrets you never fully processed, mistakes you never fully accepted, moments where you wish you had acted differently, relationships that did not go the way you hoped, words that cannot be taken back. And when you are younger, you can often outrun these things. You stay busy enough that they remain in the background. But later in life they have a way of returning, not to punish you, but simply because they were never truly resolved. What I have learned is that most people misunderstand this part of aging. They think it is a sign of decline in the mind, but I do not see it that way. I see it as an invitation to become more complete. Because if you are willing to look at your own life honestly, without trying to edit it, without trying to make yourself the perfect version of your own story, something very important happens. You begin to realize that you are not only the person you wanted to be, but also the person you actually were. You were sometimes kind and sometimes selfish, sometimes brave and sometimes afraid, sometimes thoughtful and sometimes careless. And instead of breaking you, this realization can actually soften you. It removes the pressure of perfection. It allows you to breathe more easily inside your own life. And something else happens too. When you become more honest with yourself, you also become more understanding of others. Because you recognize that every person is carrying their own contradictions, their own hidden struggles, their own unfinished emotional history. And suddenly you become less quick to judge, less quick to assume, less quick to react with anger or disappointment. Not because you approve of everything, but because you finally understand complexity in yourself and in others. And that brings me to the third thing I have learned, something that becomes very real for many people as they enter later life, and that is the quiet question of meaning. Because there often comes a stage where the structure of life changes so much that people begin to wonder what their purpose is now. For many decades, life is organized around doing, building, achieving, contributing, and being useful in visible ways. There is always something to complete, something to improve, something to reach for. But then, slowly, that external structure begins to loosen. Work ends, responsibilities change, the world no longer measures you in the same way, and suddenly the questions shift. It is no longer about what you are building outside. It becomes about what all of that has built inside you. And this is where many people feel lost, because they are still trying to use the old definitions of meaning in a new stage of life. But what I have come to understand is that meaning does not disappear when productivity decreases. It simply changes form. It becomes less about output and more about understanding. Less about doing, more and more about integrating what has already been lived. It becomes about taking the experiences of an entire lifetime and allowing them to become wisdom rather than just memory. A conversation shared with care, a moment of listening without judgment, a simple act of presence with another person. These things begin to carry a depth that was not visible in earlier years, because now they are no longer driven by ambition, but by awareness. And finally, there is the fourth thing I have learned, and this one quietly ties everything together, and that is learning to love without holding too tightly. Because as life moves forward, relationships naturally change. People drift, children grow independent, friendships evolve, distance appears in ways that are not always planned or personal. And if you are not careful, you can begin to interpret that distance as loss, as rejection, as proof that you are no longer needed. But most of the time that is not the truth. It is simply life moving as it always does. What I have learned is that love becomes much healthier when it is not built on control or constant reassurance. When you stop trying to hold people in place emotionally, when you stop measuring their presence as proof of your worth, something changes. You begin to appreciate people more for who they are, not for how often they are available. You begin to value moments rather than permanence. And strangely enough, relationships often become lighter, warmer, and more sincere when they are not burdened by fear. Once you begin to understand how love changes in later life, something else starts to open up inside you. You realize that holding people tightly does not actually protect the relationship. It only creates pressure inside it. And over time, pressure does not keep things closer, it pushes them away. So what I have learned, very slowly, and sometimes painfully, is that love has to become something more open, something more like allowing rather than controlling. When someone does not call, when someone does not visit as often as you hoped, when someone seems busy with their own world, the first reaction inside you may still be emotional, of course, because we are human and we care. But after that first wave passes, there is another place you can choose to stand in, a quieter place, where you do not immediately turn absence into meaning, and you do not immediately turn distance into rejection. And this is not something I understood early in life. In fact, I think most of us learn the opposite when we are younger. We learn to hold on, to secure, to make sure, to keep things stable by effort. But life does not remain stable in that way. People change, circumstances shift, time moves. And if your sense of love depends on everything staying the same, then you will suffer constantly. So I had to learn gradually that a healthy heart can miss someone without turning that missing into fear. A healthy heart can feel longing without turning it into demand. A healthy heart can accept that someone is far away without concluding that they no longer care. And strangely enough, when I began to live that way, my relationships did not weaken. They became more peaceful. Because people can feel when they are being emotionally held too tightly, even if nothing is said out loud. And they can also feel when they are being allowed to breathe. When you give someone space to be themselves, without pressure, without expectation, without emotional debt, they often return in a more genuine way. Not because they are forced to, but because the connection itself feels safe again. And that brings me to the deeper truth underneath all of this, the fourth lesson, which is really about meaning in the later season of life, and how it quietly transforms everything else. Because there comes a stage where many people begin to feel a kind of inner emptiness, not always dramatic, not always obvious, but a subtle sense that something has changed in the way life feels. The roles that once defined you are no longer there in the same way. The urgency that once filled your days has softened. The world no longer constantly asks you to perform at the same level, and at first, that can feel like loss. It can feel like fading. It can feel like becoming invisible. But I have come to believe that this feeling is not a sign that life is ending in meaning, but a sign that meaning is changing its location. Because when you are younger, meaning is mostly external. It is about what you are building, what you are achieving, what you are contributing in visible ways. But later, meaning begins to move inward. It becomes less about what you are producing and more about what you are understanding. It becomes less about how much you are doing and more about how deeply you are seeing. And if you are willing to adjust to that shift, life does not become empty. It becomes quieter, yes, but also more grounded, more real, more honest. I have found that some of the most meaningful moments in later life do not look impressive from the outside at all. Sitting with someone in silence who simply needs company, listening without interrupting, sharing a story not to teach, but to connect, walking slowly and noticing things that were always there, but never fully seen before. These moments do not announce themselves as important, but they carry a depth that younger ambitions often overlook. Because they are not about expansion anymore. They are about presence. And I think this is where many people misunderstand aging. They think that when you are no longer building, you are no longer becoming. But I do not believe that is true. You are still becoming, just in a different direction. You are becoming more distilled, more honest, less distracted by things that do not last, and more aware of what actually matters when everything unnecessary is stripped away. There is also something else I have noticed in this stage of life, something very subtle but very real. It is the way experience slowly turns into understanding if you allow it to. A lifetime of events, both good and painful, begins to form something inside you that is not just memory, but perspective. And that perspective becomes something you can share, not as advice forced onto others, but as quiet presence, as stability, as a kind of calm that other people can feel when they are struggling. I once knew someone who had spent most of her life as a teacher. When she retired, she felt completely lost at first. For decades, her identity had been connected to a classroom, to students, to a schedule, to a clear sense of purpose every day. And then suddenly, that structure was gone. At first, she thought her usefulness had ended. But over time, she began to notice something important. The teaching had not actually disappeared. It had simply changed form. She was still teaching, but in quieter ways, in conversations, in encouragement, in the way she listened without rushing, in the way she shared her experience when someone needed guidance. Nothing formal, nothing structured, but still deeply meaningful. And that is when she realized that purpose does not always retire when your job does. And I think many people in later life rediscover something similar if they allow themselves to. That you are not defined only by what you do in the most visible sense. You are also defined by what you carry, what you understand, what you can offer simply by being who you are after all these years. And when you begin to live from that place, something very important changes in your relationship with yourself. You stop measuring your worth through productivity. You stop asking whether you are still useful in the same way you once were. And instead, you begin to notice something much quieter, but much more stable. The fact that your presence itself has value, even when nothing is being produced from it. And so when I look at everything I have learned so far, I see a pattern forming. First, learning to be with yourself. Second, learning to face yourself honestly. Third, learning to find meaning that fits this season of life. And fourth, learning to love without turning love into control or fear. These are not separate lessons. They are connected. They all lead toward the same place, which is a life that is less driven by anxiety and more grounded in acceptance. Because in the end, what I have realized is that growing older is not about losing life. It is about seeing life more clearly, without so much noise in the way. And when the noise fades, what remains is not emptiness, but something much more subtle, something more steady, something that feels like understanding. So if you are in this stage of life, or approaching it, or even just thinking about it, I would say this gently. Do not measure this season by what it no longer gives you compared to the past. Measure it by what it is asking you to notice now. Because there is still so much here. Still relationships. Still meaning. Still connection. still depth, still life itself, in a form that is quieter, but not lesser. And I will end here by saying thank you for listening to these words. Thank you for spending this time with me, even if only in thought and presence. I am grateful for it. I hope wherever you are finding a little more peace in your own way, and a little more understanding of your own journey. Take care of yourself. Thank you for listening, and goodbye.